It happened quietly at first. On July 27, 2025, in the heart of Oslo, the Nobel Committee released a shortlist of 5 names. 4 were expected: diplomats, humanitarians, heads of state. But the 5th name made the world stop. Ibrahim Traoré, a 36-year-old soldier, a man who came to power through a coup, not an election, a leader from one of the poorest nations on earth. The headlines were immediate. The debate was fiery. But for millions across Africa, it was not shock. It was justice long delayed. Because this wasn't just a nomination, it was a statement that peace no longer belongs only to polished speeches and foreign suits. It can wear boots. It can dig in the soil. It can speak with the voice of the forgotten. You're watching Spirit of Africa. Subscribe now, because this is not just a story. It's history, and it's still being written. Long before the nomination, before the headlines, before the chants under lantern light in Ouagadougou, there was only silence and dust. On September 29, 2022, Ibrahim Traoré seized power in Burkina Faso. No vote, no campaign, just conviction and a gun. At 34, he became the world's youngest head of state. To the West, it was another military coup. To his people, it was something else, a last chance. What followed defied every forecast. Within 18 months, Burkina Faso planted 800 million trees across the Sahel, returned nearly 4 million hectares of stolen land to local farmers, cut government spending by 60%, built 400 schools, and gave free lunches to 95% of rural children. He didn't ask for applause. He didn't hold press conferences. He picked up a shovel and called on others to do the same. So when Oslo called his name in July 2025, it wasn't just about what he said, it was about what he planted, in red soil and in people's hearts. And yet this man now on the global stage still calls himself a farmer in uniform. He didn't ask for the palace. He never ran for office. He never wore silk suits or gave rehearsed speeches to global summits. Ibrahim Traoré was a soldier, not a strategist in an air-conditioned war room, but a man who knew the heat of red dust, the silence of ambush, the sound of children crying between gunfire and drought. And yet in September 2022, at just 34 years old, he did what few dared. He took power. Not through elections, not through slogans, but through force, and some say through necessity. The country was collapsing. Burkina Faso, once a French colony and long a fragile democracy, had become a battlefield, not just of bullets, but of broken promises. Terrorist factions ruled vast stretches of rural land. Foreign military bases dotted the landscape, promising security but delivering more fear. Food prices soared, trust in government disappeared, schools shut down, families fled, and the people, always the people, waited for someone, anyone. But no one came, so Traoré did. To some he was a usurper, to others a rebel, but to many he was something far more dangerous. A man who did not want power for himself, because once in power he did not ask for protection, he asked for a shovel. And that is where the story breaks from tradition. Within weeks, he began dissolving the layers of privilege that had ruled Burkina Faso for decades. He cut his own salary. He sold luxury government vehicles. He redirected funds to repair rural roads, buy school supplies, and distribute tools to farming cooperatives. He didn't build walls. He built clinics. And when asked why he rejected IMF loans, he replied, "Because we are not beggars, we are builders." Then came the most radical act of all. Instead of waging war against the 12,000 armed insurgents hiding in forests and villages, Traoré chose dialogue. "Peace is not won with bullets," he said. "It begins when a man believes he no longer needs one." He launched community reconciliation programs offering amnesty and vocational training. He spoke with village elders, not generals. And in one symbolic act, he ordered the removal of checkpoints guarded by foreign troops and replaced them with local patrols made up of former fighters turned farmers. Some laughed. Some called him naive, but the violence dropped. The fighters once called terrorists were now plowing fields. And the people, once afraid of both government and rebel, finally began to breathe again. But Traoré wasn't done. In early 2023, he announced the return of 3.8 million hectares of farmland land that had been leased or seized by foreign corporations, often under development contracts, with hidden clauses and minimal taxes. The land, he said, belongs to those who feed the nation, not to those who fly in for conferences. The message was clear. Burkina Faso would no longer be managed from abroad. And then came the Sahel Life Alliance, a coalition of Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, united not just by military resistance, but by something even more revolutionary, ecological rebirth. Together they planted 800 million trees across the Sahel zone. Not a PR campaign, not a UN-funded reforestation program, but a grassroots mobilization. Villagers, students, former soldiers, even prisoners planting saplings under a banner that read, "If we reclaim the soil, we reclaim the future." At the heart of it all stood Traore. No throne, no crown, just a shovel, and sometimes a megaphone. He visited new schools barefoot. He shared meals with construction crews. He held town halls under mango trees, not in press rooms. If you're still listening, ask yourself, when was the last time you saw a head of state with dirt under his nails and no guards around his table? That is why the people called him the general who didn't want power. Because real power, they said, is the ability to give it away. And yet, for all this, international media rarely covered him. Western think tanks brushed him aside as unstable populism. Aid agencies hesitated. Diplomats stayed distant. Why? Because Traoré did not follow the script. He banned French mining companies that had looted gold and left polluted rivers. He rejected World Bank loan conditions that prioritized efficiency over sovereignty. He nationalized food distribution, directing surplus grains to school lunch programs. He didn't talk about development goals. He built them. In the span of 18 months, 400 schools constructed, 700 clinics opened. Rural school lunch coverage jumped to 95% using local food from local farms. Government spending slashed by 60%. A new youth farming corps created, named not for battle, but for harvest, Farmers of Peace. In a final act that stunned even his critics on May 4, 2025, Traoré pardoned 100 former militants, welcoming them into the National Agriculture Program. The United Nations called it a model of conflict transformation, but Traoré refused the credit. "I do not lead to impress the world," he said. "I lead so my people can eat, learn, and live without fear." And so, when the Nobel Committee said his name in Oslo, it was not a surprise to his people. They had been watching this farmer in uniform change their lives every day. With each seed planted, each gun laid down, each clinic opened, they had already given him their prize. Now the world was catching up. If this moved you even a little, write, "We plant peace" in the comments. Let them know we remember leaders who build, not those who borrow. It was a quiet moment in a place where silence often carries the weight of centuries. On July 1st, 2025, during the Feast of All Saints, a voice echoed from the heart of Vatican City, not through formal decree, not through diplomacy, but from the pulpit where words still burn like incense. Pope Leo XIV stood before a crowd of believers and offered a name, not of a saint, not of a theologian, not of a martyr, but of a soldier from Burkina Faso, a farmer in uniform. "When I pray for peace," the Pope said, "the face that rises in my heart is not from Rome or Geneva. It is the face of a young man in dusty boots standing beside a child planting a tree." There was no applause, only stillness. Because in that moment something radical happened. The Church broke its silence on Africa's forgotten revolutions. And it did so by naming Ibrahim Traoré. This was not a political gesture, it was spiritual. A recognition not of office, but of labor, not of lineage, but of love. The Vatican's endorsement was historic. Never before had a sitting African leader who came to power through a military transition been publicly supported by the Holy See, let alone nominated by it for the Nobel Peace Prize. It was more than symbolic. It was tectonic. Because the Pope did not speak of Traoré's statistics, not the schools, the clinics, or the land reform. He spoke of his soul. He does not preach through scripture, the Pope continued. He preaches through sweat. He builds not cathedrals, but futures. And though he has never stepped inside the halls of this Vatican, he lives as though the world's poor are his sanctuary. For a continent long dismissed as a battleground, this was a benediction. For millions of Africans, Catholic and not, it was a divine confirmation that dignity was not a Western export. It could be born in red soil. And while the Pope's words ignited praise across the Sahel, they caused murmurs elsewhere. Some diplomats called it reckless. A few European commentators asked, "Is the church legitimizing coups now?" Others feared it would send the wrong message that power seized through force was being blessed by holy hands. But they missed the point entirely. The Vatican wasn't validating the seizure of power, it was validating what came after the healing, the feeding, the planting, the transformation of leadership from privilege to service. Because what do you call a man who walks away from palace feasts to sit with barefoot farmers? What do you call a general who exchanges rifles for seeds? If not holy, then what? Let us ask plainly, when the world elevates men who sign peace treaties they never honor but ignores those who grow peace with their hands, what gospel are we really following? The papal endorsement shook diplomatic circles. France, Burkina Faso's former colonial ruler, responded with guarded respect. President Nobel Peace said, "We may not align with all of President Traoré's methods, but we cannot ignore his results. He is writing a new chapter in Africa's story with action, not aid." It was the closest thing to a confession the Republic had ever made. That the post-colonial world was no longer listening, it was now answering. In Washington, Secretary of State Janet R. Collins struck a more cautious tone. "We acknowledge Mr. Traoré's efforts toward regional stability. This nomination gives the international community an opportunity to rethink what peace truly means in the 21st century. A carefully balanced statement. Yet behind it was an unmistakable discomfort. Because Traoré's methods did not fit within any strategic doctrine. He rejected IMF loans, he banned foreign mining firms, he prioritized food over finance, he nationalized distribution, and he brought former militants into the fold not as threats, but as farmers. In short, he made peace inconvenient. Brazil's President Luiz G. Costa was more direct. I once called him the new Sankara, but he corrected me. He said, "No, I am just a farmer in uniform." That's when I knew he deserves the Nobel. Costa's words resonated across the global south. In Latin America, Asia, and North Africa, it was seen as a moment of kinship, a bridge between continents long denied the dignity of writing their own destiny. In Russia, the message was even clearer. Their president remarked, "He is a builder not of ideologies, but of food systems, of schools, and of belief." And while geopolitics churned in the background in Burkina Faso, something deeper took root. Night fell over Ouagadougou. But the city did not sleep. From the airport road to Thomas Sankara Square, tens of thousands gathered beneath homemade lanterns. Children carried candles, women wore white. Drummers beat rhythms older than any colonial statue that still stood. And in the center of it all hung a banner, "We no longer beg. Now the world comes to us." In that moment, the Nobel Prize became something more than a nomination. It became a mirror for Africa to see itself, and for the world to reckon with what it had long ignored. Radio stations buzzed. Mothers wept not from grief but relief. In villages where gunfire once ruled the night, former rebels now irrigated maize. Each water pump bore a painted label, "Farmers of Peace." And still Traoré stayed silent. No grand statements, no victory speeches. Until one evening from the presidential balcony he addressed the crowd. "This nomination is not mine. It belongs to every mother who fed a child from her own field, to every youth who picked up a shovel instead of a rifle, to every teacher who taught under a tree. We do not build peace to impress the world. We build peace to survive." And in that silence, after his voice faded, the world listened. Because this wasn't just an African story anymore. It was a spiritual revolution, one that refused to bow before power and knelt only before justice. If this part of the story moved, you say amen in the comments. Because maybe, just maybe, holiness begins in the hands that heal, not just the ones that preach. At first they dismissed him. A soldier without polish, a president without pedigree, a leader without the approval of Western capitals. But when the Vatican spoke, the world could no longer pretend not to hear. Because when Rome names a man of dust and discipline, even the most powerful must pause. Ibrahim Traoré had crossed a threshold. He was no longer just a regional figure. He was now, whether they admitted it or not, a global symbol. And symbols cannot be ignored. Within days of the Vatican's endorsement, foreign ministries across the globe scrambled for language. France, long haunted by its colonial shadow in Burkina Faso, released a cautious statement. We recognize the progress made under President Traoré's administration. While we advocate for democratic norms, we also respect the aspirations of the Burkinabe people. It was a diplomatic dance acknowledgement without applause. But in Paris, behind closed doors, officials knew what it meant. For decades, France had shaped African narratives. Now, it was responding to one. In Washington, the tone was even more calculated. A press release from the U.S. State Department read, "We are observing the developments in Burkina Faso with interest. The nomination of Mr. Traoré invites a broader conversation about sustainable peace, local leadership, and post-conflict reconstruction. In translation, we can't stop this movement, but we'll try to define it." Still, the shift was undeniable. Germany called the nomination a challenge to conventional peace paradigms. Canada commended Burkina Faso's investment in social infrastructure. India, sensing opportunity, dispatched a quiet delegation to explore cooperation in education and agriculture. And in China, state media ran a rare editorial. Africa is finding its own voice, not in foreign capitals, but in its own villages. Everywhere, the message was clear. The old order was being forced to listen. But what exactly were they hearing? They were hearing that peace could be planted, not negotiated. That leadership didn't require suits, but service. That healing a nation didn't begin with loans, but with land. They were hearing that a continent long defined by tragedy could now define itself through harvest. And they didn't know what to do with that. Because Traoré's methods were not familiar. He rejected IMF and World Bank conditions, not with protest, but with alternatives. He nationalized school lunch programs, sourcing all food from local farmers. He banned exploitative mining contracts that had robbed the country for generations. He slashed government luxury spending by 60% and redirected it into clinics, roads, and irrigation systems. This wasn't theory, it was transformation. And so the usual criticisms, authoritarian, populist, untested, began to fade. Not because they stopped trying, but because reality made those labels useless. How do you call a man a tyrant when he builds 400 schools and opens 700 clinics in under 2 years, while your allies cut education budgets and close hospitals? Even those who disliked Traoré's rise had to admit his record was difficult to argue with. That's why some shifted the conversation, from results to origins. But he came to power through a military coup, they insisted. Yes, he did. But so did many who became statesmen. So did those who were later invited to Davos and praised in Time magazine. And more importantly, is how a man enters power more important than what he does with it? That became the defining debate. At the African Union, pressure mounted. Several member states, including Guinea, Mali, and Chad, called for a revision of AU protocols that automatically isolate leaders who rise through non-electoral means. We cannot keep judging leaders by how they rise. One AU commissioner said anonymously, "We must judge them by how their people rise because of them." It was a turning point, and not just diplomatically, but morally, because across Africa, something unexpected was happening. In university campuses from Lagos to Lusaka, students held debates titled "Peace Beyond Elections." In Nairobi, graffiti on the side of a crumbling ministry wall read, "If democracy ignores the hungry, what good is the ballot?" In Johannesburg, a student painted a mural of Traoré's face emerging from a field of maize. Beneath it, the words, "He didn't run for office. He ran irrigation lines." Even in skeptical capitals, quiet respect began to take root. Not love, not loyalty, but recognition. Because Traoré was proving a dangerous idea that Africa could build without permission. And that shook more than governments. It shook assumptions. For too long, the world saw African success as something that had to be validated by outside voices. A project needed international funding, a reform needed expert consultancy, a president needed election observers to be real. But Traore changed the rules. He said, "We are not waiting to be approved. We are feeding our people first." And suddenly millions began to ask, why haven't our leaders done the same? That question, whispered at first, became a roar. From Mali to Madagascar, youth movements adopted his phrase, "We plant peace." On social media, Nobel for Africa trended globally. In cities that once echoed with despair, now echoed with one name, Traore. And yet, not everyone celebrated. Some elders warned global recognition brings global pressure. And they weren't wrong. Already economic lobbies were pressuring banks not to partner with Burkina Faso. Already intelligence briefings in Western capitals raised alarms about the spread of Traorism, because this wasn't just about one man anymore, it was about an idea, and ideas once planted are hard to kill. And so on the global stage something rare occurred. The same voices that once ignored Africa, now whispered about it behind closed doors. And for once it was not because of war, but because of wheat, because of schools, because of clinics, because of peace that didn't come from treaties, but from trust. Because now the world is watching, not out of pity, but out of curiosity, and perhaps fear. Because Traore did not ask to be part of the conversation, he started a new one. And now, for the first time in generations, Africa is speaking not in borrowed languages, but in its own. And the world, finally, is listening. Long before Oslo, long before the cameras and ceremonies, there was a woman named Mariam. She lived in a village that didn't exist on most maps. A place where children learned to count using stones, where roofs were patched with plastic and the well dried up by March. But Mariam had a shovel and 3 grandchildren. And when the local government under Traore's new program delivered cassava cuttings and promised training, she didn't ask questions. She planted. Not because she believed in politics, but because she believed in tomorrow. By the next season, her plot tripled in yield. She didn't sell it. She fed 5 neighboring families, including one that had lost a father to the violence years before. No one gave her a prize, but they did give her a name, Maman Paix, Mother Peace. And she is not alone. There is Solimane, once a rebel fighter, now a teacher. He carries a scar across his cheek and books under his arm. Each morning he walks 5 kilometers to a classroom with no windows. He teaches algebra on a chalkboard nailed to a mango tree. When he finishes, he doesn't go home. He visits farms to help build irrigation lines. Then he prays with the elders for rain and for forgiveness. There is Awa, a nurse who never finished medical school because her school was bombed. But today, in a new rural clinic built from bricks the villagers made themselves, she delivers babies, treats malaria, and teaches mothers how to make oral rehydration salt. She wears no uniform, only pride, and she signs every patient's file with the words, "Servant of Life." And there are thousands more. Children who now walk to school instead of war. Ex-soldiers who now dig wells instead of graves. Teenagers who dream of tractors, not rifles. Elders who smile again because they see their land feeding their people. These are the ones who built the peace before the world ever noticed. These are the ones who earned the prize before the committee ever met. So if you ask who deserves the Nobel, we say Ibrahim Traoré lit the fire. But the people, the farmers, teachers, mothers, rebels, turned planters, they kept it burning. And maybe that's what peace truly is. Not a signature, but a seed, planted, watered, shared, and never forgotten. The fire did not begin in Oslo. It did not begin in a nomination. It began in silence. When one man knelt before the earth and dug his hands into the soil. That spark born in Burkina Faso is now catching wind. In Niger, young engineers are building grain silos from recycled material. In Mali, women's cooperatives are reclaiming abandoned fields. In Chad, former child soldiers are growing rice in craters left by war. And across the continent, something deeper is shifting. No more waiting, no more asking, no more begging to be seen, because they have seen themselves. In the face of a president who calls himself a farmer, in the face of their own mothers, their own sons, their own villages, still standing, still fighting, still planting. This is not just Traore's moment, it is Africa's reckoning, not with revenge, but with rebirth, not with applause, but with action. And now it is our turn, because what began in red soil must not stop at red carpets. We, the sons and daughters of Africa scattered across oceans, we who were taught that power wears a suit and speaks foreign tongues, we now know better. We have seen boots plant peace. We have seen calloused hands teach justice. We have seen dignity not as a gift but as a harvest. So the question is not whether Traoré deserves the Nobel. The question is, will we carry the fire? Will we feed it with our stories, our service, our stubborn hope? Because Oslo may shine with ceremony, but the real light is in Ouagadougou, in Kampala, in Kisangani, in every mother's kitchen and every child's classroom. The world may celebrate Traoré for a moment, but if we are bold, if we are ready, the world will remember Africa forever. Drop a comment below that says, "We carry the fire." Let them know this flame will not die in headlines. It will live in hands, in harvest, in hope. Subscribe to Spirit of Africa, not just to witness the rise, but to be part of it, because this is not the end. This is only the beginning. Amen.